Welcome back to the second lecture on the Spanish and the Netherlands. At the end of the last lecture, we were talking about the fact that a number of the lesser nobility, called the Confederates, had barged into Margaret's chambers, demanding that she recognize the demands put forward in their request. And so what we're going to do is pick up this time, and I think I talked about the idea of the seeds of nationalism germinating as we see these forces clashing, that is the Spanish Catholic Habsburg forces and the Protestant Dutch forces that are going to clash over political issues, over social issues, over economic issues, and over religious issues. And so out of these this clash, we see the seeds of a new state forming. So we're going to pick up this time with the idea that Margaret in 1566, August 23, is going to concede or capitulate to the Confederates, saying that she had no choice. And she grants the freedom of worship to Protestants in all places where it was established in the Netherlands. This agreement was known simply as the Accord, and Margaret wisely gave enforcement of this agreement to the Dutch grandees. Yet the Calvinists, a minority at this time in the Netherlands, were really unwilling to relent in their aggressive campaign to expand their presence in the towns of the northern part of the Netherlands, the Dutch part of the Netherlands. And the grandees who were tasked with enforcing the accord actually gave their consent to the building of Protestant churches. You see a Protestant church pictured there. And this really greatly upset Margaret, who feels as though she had been betrayed by the Dutch grandees, who really violated the accords, violated the terms of the accord. So what Margaret does is she declares several of these Protestant towns, Tournai and Valenciennes. They kind of got cut off in this map that you can't see them, but in other words, there were two towns in the Dutch areas, and she declares them to be in a state of rebellion. And at this point, the great Dutch nobles, William and Egmont and Horns, come back to their senses, and they side with Margaret and King Philip. And they realize that their actions had really upset and disturbed the peace. And it seems as though they were in the process of trying to restore peace in the Dutch lands when a large Spanish army arrived. 10,000 soldiers led by the Duke of Alva had marched from Spain all the way up to the Netherlands, and they arrive on the scene with the order to pacify the Dutch lands and eradicate all forms of heresy. And remember, heresy is an open act of rebellion, not only against the Catholic Church and therefore God, but also against the king, in this case Philip II. And remember, it's worth repeating, the Habsburgs are a super committed, faithful Catholic family, and the Habsburgs see the restoration of, remember, the Catholic kind of duvet cover. They see that as a good way to strengthen their own royal position, their own sovereignty. And so that's what you see. And you see here on the right an unfortunate Dutch heretic Protestant being burned at the stake. And so that's what eradication really looks like in its most severe forms. So the presence of this large Spanish army is going to alter things greatly in the Netherlands. And here you see pictured on the left the Duke of Alva, and then something that the Duke of Alva created to restore order was something called the Council, or the Council of Troubles. Sorry, kind of stumbling over my words there. And this was going to be how Alba, working together with church officials, was going to hunt down heretics, bring them to trial, and find them guilty, and allow them either to recant and come back to the Catholic fold, or they would be executed. Now, 9,000. There were 12,000 cases between 1567 and 1572. So this is a pretty active council, that is a court. In 5 years, 12,000 cases. 9,000 were declared guilty, and these 9,000 lost some or all their property, but they came back to the church, it would seem, because they weren't put to death, whereas 1,000 were actually put to death. And it's interesting, the Calvinists that were targeted and brought before this court, you've got to remember that these were the most successful merchants, bankers, and lawyers who really ran society and helped to create the wealth and prosperity that the people of the Netherlands and the Dutch sections in particular were enjoying. So if the king were interested in, that is King Philip in Spain, were interested in really promoting economic growth, it seems that his policy of religious purity and purification or cleansing went against that aim. And it seems as though, again, the king put religion and religious purity above economic health and well-being. So an interesting thing. And in fact, the counts of Horns and Egmont, two of those three great grandees, are going to themselves be brought before the Council of Troubles and executed. William of Orange, the other of those three that we've seen, is going to be able to escape and go into exile, but he's going to come back leading Protestant forces with him. So, as I said, that William the Orange of Orange fled, but he returned with a ragtag band of soldiers 1 year later in 1568, and he was defeated by the Spanish troops. Now, what is going to happen? Well, the Duke of Alva quickly realizes that he needs a lot of money to pay for these Spanish soldiers, numbering 10,000, some historians say 12,000. So what he does is he declares a new tax on the subjects of the Netherlands. Yet 4 of the 17 provincial states protest, and they actually send a delegation to Spain to take up the matter in person with King Philip II. And then a curious event happens. These taxes were quite unpopular, and it seems as though taxes then and now cause trouble, stir up trouble and resentment. And in April 1572, a group of sailors or pirates, acting in the name of William the Orange, occupied the Dutch town of Brill. And then from there, they would go on to occupy other towns along the Dutch coast. And this was a sign then of open resistance, active open resistance to the king. And this is going to set in motion a chain of events that is also going to draw in the Protestant Queen Elizabeth in England, as well as the French Huguenot leaders in France. And both Queen Elizabeth and the French Huguenots see an opportunity to aid their Protestant brethren, but also kind of stir up trouble, in this case directed at the Spanish. So anytime the English can cause trouble for the Habsburg Spanish, they do so. The French Huguenots are also trying to cause trouble for the Spanish as well. So what we see here with the Sea Beggars actions that began in 1572 is the rapid expansion of, again, an internal affair. The Dutch internal affair then becomes or takes on an international dimension that's going to drive things forward in interesting ways. Now, what also is true is that the Spanish continued to resist and continued to fight against the Protestants, against the heretics, and they were rather unsuccessful. Typically what the Dutch would do when the Spanish besieged a city, the Dutch would simply open up the dikes and the sea waters would flood the lands, making transport and fighting for troops next to impossible. So that's the story. Meanwhile, the Spanish troops, however, were murdering prisoners and inhabitants of towns where they did manage to take towns. And they did so to make an example of those that resisted the king. They would be dealt with harshly. But that didn't have the intended effect. The more the Spanish mistreated the people of the Netherlands, the Dutch in this case, the more the Dutch people resisted. So the heavy hand, or what Machiavelli would call the lion, seems to have paid very poor dividends to the Spanish. And I think two things are clear then. Excessive cruelty and religious fervor on the part of the Calvinists is really going to inspire the Dutch. So had the Spanish not been and behaved as cruelly, maybe had the religious element not been present, the Dutch revolt might have, simply put, run its course, and the Spanish would have maintained their presence in the Netherlands. But that's not going to be the case. And the other thing that occurred was the Spanish King Philip began to run out of money. And he's going to declare bankruptcy several times. So the idea that he needs money to be able to support his army is a problem. Armies in the field that don't get paid what they're owed sometimes go off and take matters into their own hands. And we saw that with the sack of Rome in 1527, and I think that's going to happen here as well. So moving forward, we've already seen this idea of Dutch resistance, and the other thing I want to mention is that a number of Dutch Calvinists, as we had the Council of Troubles and Spanish persecution of the Protestant heretics, actually fled Holland and went across the border into the areas of the Holy Roman Empire that themselves were Protestant, and they found safe refuge, and they were able to meet and to form communities of Protestants. And that was very important, because the idea was they formed these communities and then they began to strategize about how to go back to Holland and fight the Spanish, and then set up their own communities in their own states. So again, this idea of war refugees, this time, however, finding safe haven right across the border to go back is something that is, I think, rather important. And the idea that Calvin in particular had a theory that combined both religion and his theology and politics, and we saw that in Geneva. So this blend of politics, religion, that produced a very durable state in itself is something that the Calvinist exiles are going to be very interested in doing, and they begin to do so in about 1572, 1573. And in fact, William of Orange, himself an exile, converts to the Calvinist faith in 1573, in large part after the St. Bartholomew Day massacre that occurred in Paris in 1572. So there are a lot of these connections and links. We see these communications begin to occur over longer and longer distances, and more players are going to get drawn in. Now, I guess the Spanish really didn't help themselves and their cause, because at one point the Spanish soldiers were bankrupt, and they began to sort of take matters into their own hands. They mutinied, they rioted, they would begin to steal things from the inhabitants of these towns and the countryside. And that caused a really serious, again, backlash from the native Dutch inhabitants. And in fact, we'll see here, on September 22nd of 1576, the States General of the northern provinces, meeting at Ghent, declared that all Spanish soldiers were outlawed in the areas of the Dutch Netherlands. And that they then had to, in fact, leave. Now, this was a direct challenge to the king. These troops were there on behalf of the king, led by the Duke of Alva, to pacify and restore order to the Dutch lands and to purify heretics. So this is a rather interesting moment here when we have this, what's called the pacification of Ghent. And you see this wonderful allegory of the pacification of Ghent, where the Dutch people are going to openly challenge the authority of the Spanish king and begin the process of trying to eliminate or push the Spanish soldiers out of their lands. So that's something that happened. Now, of course, the Spanish troops react rather violently. They target this town of Antwerp, which is today in Belgium, but at the time it was in parts of the Netherlands. And Belgium, Antwerp is actually in the southern part. You can see it there right below the blue areas in the, sort of the center there. And the Spanish laid waste to this town of Antwerp, and they massacred upwards of 7,000 people. So we see these massacres, we see assassinations. I think you can see the recurring theme that we're encountering here in early modern Europe is a lot of violence that's motivated by political, but also religious and social concerns. Now, after this, what happened was you have a rare moment of unity between the northern areas of the Netherlands and the southern area of the Netherlands, and that was called the Union of Brussels. And this was an attempt by all peoples in the Netherlands to oppose Spanish and Spanish rule. And the idea was that the northern part that was Protestant, the southern part that was Catholic, they would set aside their religious differences to work together with the common goal of defeating the Spanish, a common enemy, and restoring Netherlands to its independence, that is, without Spanish control or overlords. Yet that didn't really last long. The southern Catholic Netherlands provinces didn't trust the northern Dutch Protestant and Calvinist provinces. There was a lot of fear on the part of the southerners that the northerners were too extreme, that they couldn't be trusted, that they were fighting for the wrong reasons, that is, to expand the Calvinist faith. So within 2 years, the southern provinces of the Netherlands break away from the northern provinces, and they're going to form two competing leagues, and that's going to be rather interesting. So we're going to see also that in 1577 and 78, there were a series of incidents known as the Calvinist outrages, and this again included Calvinist attacks on religious icons and churches, and the reestablishment of public worship. And it's really that drove the Catholics in the South to abandon this project of unity, and drove the southern areas back into the arms of the Spanish, again fearing the Calvinist outrages. So purely, I think, religion here. And then we're going to see, as I said, these two areas. So in 1579, we see, in January of 1579 rather, the northern provinces formed the Union of Utrecht and agreed to fight for religious freedom and also for the right to govern themselves as they saw fit. This is new, and I think this is worth jotting down and capturing. So they're not only fighting for their religious freedoms, they're now also fighting for their political freedoms. And in July 1581, the States General of the areas of Utrecht, that is the Union of Utrecht, formally depose King Philip II. Now, that might be an event that doesn't mean much to you. This is the history of the Netherlands. Big deal, 1581. However, one should remember that at one point, the North American British colonists actually depose King George III. That begins a war of independence, or a revolution that leads to the founding of a nation, that's the United States. And I think this is something that's going on, and I think there's a very similar process. There are a lot of parallels here. So in fact, one could study the history of the American Revolution and go back to the history of the Dutch Revolution to see how that all works. Now, in the same year, then, the southern provinces of Hainaut, Artois, Walloon, and Flanders, they form what's known as the Union of Arras. And they are going to recognize Philip as their sovereign. They're going to recognize their religion as the Catholic religion, and that they felt that the Catholic religion, along with Habsburg Spain, represented the best chance against chaos and anarchy. And so these two leagues are going to form. Philip appointed a new general, the Duke of Alva, having failed in his mission to restore order to the Netherlands, was brought back to Spain. Now we have the Duke of Parma, a man named Alexander Farnese, so an Italian working for the Spanish King Philip. He becomes the Governor General of the Union of Arras. He has a fresh set of troops, numbering in the thousands, both Spanish and Italian mercenaries, and he begins a war to take back land and cities in the Netherlands. And over a period of 7 years, from 1581 to 1588, he's very successful. in recapturing a lot of the lands. And I think you can see the map there of the Dutch revolt in 1576 and then 1579. But then look what happens by 1580, 1588. All those areas that are green, or light green, are going to be areas that are recaptured by the Spanish under the leadership of Alexander Farnese. The areas that are orange are going to be those that remain in the hands of the Dutch Calvinists. So the Spanish forces, however, never succeed in conquering the 7 northern provinces. And you might ask why. And that's a good question. I mean, they're much smaller. They're largely outnumbered. The Spanish armies are large, yet the Dutch Protestants had very powerful, important allies. And the most powerful ally they had was Queen Elizabeth, who signed an alliance with the League of Utrecht, the Union of Utrecht, and agreed to finance 25% of the cost of the war against Spain. And at this point, too, it's worth mentioning, the Spanish actually had a plot to execute Elizabeth. Again, Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and she really is responsible for taking the English church, which had been kind of proto-Catholic, and really making it into a full-fledged Protestant church. The Spanish Habsburgs, again, ultra-Catholic, resent that. There's even some notion that Philip II might have tried to court Elizabeth but was rejected, spurned. So there's this idea of assassinating Queen Elizabeth. The plot doesn't come to fruition. Nonetheless, Elizabeth gets word of it and then wants to sort of fight back and make life difficult for the Spanish. And that's what happened. So Philip, however, is not content, and he decides that he would like to launch a full-scale invasion of the England, and he's going to do so launching it from the areas of the Union of Arras in the Netherlands. So he's going to amass a great fleet of ships that are going to cross the Channel and invade England, except for the fact that the English Navy is prepared. And you see the English Navy there on the right. And bad weather also interfered with his plans, so that the Spanish Armada is completely defeated, destroyed, and his dream of invading England falls apart, literally. And so what that does, though, is that allows these tiny areas, these 7 tiny provinces of the northern Netherlands, the Dutch provinces, to sort of survive, because Philip is now engaged in larger geopolitical concerns with England, and then Philip's going to also invade France. At what point Henry IV, remember Henry of Navarre, was a Protestant who becomes king because everybody else gets wiped out by assassination. And in 1593, Henry of Navarre, a Calvinist, converts to Catholicism. Yet Philip II never really believed it, never thought Henry was sincere, and Philip used that as a pretext to invade France. Now, Philip's invasion of France also fails. However, again, the Protestant provinces in Holland are able then to really survive because of these larger geopolitical events surrounding them, and Philip II was too stretched too thin, if you will. So at that point, we're going to see that the areas then of the Union of Utrecht are going to survive and actually thrive at some point. So the end of the story is that by the end of the 1590s, Philip realized he was overextended, and he seeks negotiated peace with the Calvinists. Now, Philip died himself in 1598. His son, Philip III, had the task, the unfortunate task of cleaning up the mess left behind by his father's policies in the Netherlands. And yet Philip wisely decided that the costs of trying to reclaim these 7 tiny provinces were far greater than the benefits to Spain. So he arranges for a ceasefire in 1607, and then a more durable peace known as the 12 Years' Truce which you see being celebrated up here in the right in 1609. Now, there will be a new round of fighting that would break out in the 1620s, and that would be part of the larger war that we'll call the 30 Years' War that began in 1618. But for now, there's this period of peace. And the other really important thing that happened was in 1609, other European nations, France and England, for example, recognized the independence of the 7 northern provinces. So we now see the creation of a Dutch state. A new nation was born. And I think that's one of the great takeaways from all of these wars of religion, is we begin to see the appearance of new territorial states that have very unique cultural identifiers that separate them from neighboring states. And in this case, we can talk about religion. We have Calvinism. We can also talk about language, the Dutch language, as opposed to areas in the southern Netherlands. So they're all part of the Netherlands, but in the south, they speak Flemish, or they speak French, not Dutch. And so there are big cultural differences that lead to differences in food, in dress, and again in religion. So the southern provinces, the Union of Arras, they're going to be Catholic. So we begin to see that the map is going to take shape in interesting ways. And we also begin to see, and we must remember that, this great plan that Philip had and his father before him, Charles V, had to impose order on Europe, a European-wide order, politically and religiously and culturally, simply put, is not possible. And if you remember, Charles V, in fact, retired, stepped down after 30 years of frustrating wars, both internal and external. And I think Philip II dies in 1598, largely having failed to secure his empire. And to use again the phrase Machiavelli used, to maintain his state. And it seems to me that, yes, there are economic things, yes, there are political and geopolitical things, but it seems to me that the seed of the revolt was, again, the competing truth claims between Catholicism and Calvinism that really ran Philip II's ship aground. So with that, I will leave you to jot down some last notes. And again, any questions, it's really helpful if you guys bring questions to class. And then we're going to work on some of the questions, the essential questions, such as why did Philip II fail to achieve his goals of European domination, given that he had so much to work with, all the advantages of his worldwide empire. Why does he fail? And the second question is, how was the new state of the Netherlands born, and how did this birth impact the map of Europe and the cultures of Europe? So with that, I'll see you guys in a future lecture.